Yeah, it's good to see you all here. Mr. Schmelke, good to see you. I have a couple of other people I recognize from 17 and 91, I believe. That was many years ago, since this is the year 18 and 18. I hope you can hear me. I'm not known for my oratory. Everyone's all right with hearing? I have a problem with that ever since the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. The topic of tonight's performance is somewhat celebratory. Do you know that it's been 30 years now since we've had a Constitution in the United States of America? And since I have, even though I'm from Virginia, I've been to New York, which some of you know, as Mr. Perillo brought out, that I came up here in 1791 and toured pretty extensively through New York and New England in 1791. I was part of the New York Ratifying Convention that helped to approve the United States Constitution. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but it might be news to some of you that just because 39 of us signed the document in Philadelphia at the Federal Convention did not make it official on September the 17th, 1787. Would men that created a republic be so ostentatious to think that 39 men could decide for an entire country that started with a document that defined their government with the words, "we the people," to say that it was official without taking it to the people for their... Zeus is coming down somewhere. I'm going to be talking about pseudonyms, and I think maybe Zeus should be one of them. Anyway, so the ratification process is a fancy word for approval. And it needed what we called a supra-majority. We didn't want just 7 states to give us a statistical majority for ratifying the Constitution. We decided somewhat arbitrarily on 9 states. And you might be interested to know that the 2 most powerful states were most reluctant to ratify or approve the United States Constitution. Who were they? My own state of Virginia and your state of New York. Could I have a show of hands, perhaps, of people that are not from the state of New York? I see one hand. Are you from far away, madam? Connecticut. From Connecticut. Roger Sherman territory. Yes. She knows about Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman was a representative at our federal convention who proposed a particular compromise, of which we had to come to hundreds of compromises during the federal convention, that was adopted by us. So he also served on the committee to help write the Declaration of Independence, which is a document that Thomas Jefferson, my good friend, is known for being the penman of. But of course I digress. You might find that I do that a bit. Can you still hear me? Very good. Well, let me start with finishing a summation of what happened in 1787. We had 39 delegates sign the Constitution, and ironically, some of my Virginia compatriots did not sign the United States Constitution. Out of 55 delegates that came and went over the course of almost 3.5 months of deliberations in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, 42 were there to sign the document, but only 39 of us did. And 2 out of the 3 that did not sign were part of my own Virginia delegation. And that was the very man that proposed the version, the plan that Virginia had, Governor Edmund Randolph. Of course, I didn't want to be the one to propose it. You can barely hear me, and I'm not an orator at all. I try and count on men's reasoning abilities and their brains to not take over their emotions, unlike some of my other compatriots that I will get to a little bit more. Does the initials PH strike a chord with anyone? As in Patrick Henry? The same Patrick Henry that said, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." He ended up not attending the Federal Convention at all, and when it came time to ratify, he fervently opposed it and took very severe steps to prevent myself or Mr. Monroe, who I was running against, to serve on the Virginia Ratifying Convention. In fact, I'll give Mr. Monroe a mention because he is our current President of the United States, now that it's 18 and 18, and I am happily in retirement. And so I do invite you all to come and visit Mrs. Madison and I in Montpelier anytime you wish. We're usually there. So the ratifying process started the following year, and there was in fact 3 states that ratified or approved the Constitution before the year was up. The first state was Delaware, the second state was Pennsylvania, and the third state was New Jersey. Then it turned into 1788, and we had 8 states ratify, and then it became to this crucial 9th state. Who would this crucial 9th state be to ratify the Constitution? Well, it probably wasn't going to be New York or Virginia, and it happened to be, just so you know, New Hampshire. And New Hampshire ratified on the first day of summer, June the 21st of 1788. And it was Virginia's contingent and New York's contingent, especially the Federalists among us, that were waiting to see who that 9th state might be. Because when it came to the New York Ratifying Convention, after returning from the Virginia Ratifying Convention to put up shop, so to speak, in New York City while your ratifying convention was going on in Poughkeepsie on the Hudson's River, I kept track of things because the newspapers were keeping track of things, and I wanted to keep track of the newspapers who were keeping track of things. And we were playing for time, and a definition of terms might be of use to you as well. Political parties have come into play, which none of the founders had anticipated or desired, but we do have political parties. And the definitions or the terminology that we used were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Federalists were those of us, including myself, that were in favor of ratifying the Constitution as is. In fact, I wanted it ratified in toto and forever, which means in total and forever. But some of my Anti-Federalist counterparts did not. They wanted amendments. They wanted other issues addressed that might make the Constitution better. So there was a war, so to speak, that played out in the newspapers that went on and also in the ratifying delegate conventions in Virginia and in New York on exactly what should transpire. And by March the 4th, we were all electing our delegates to the ratifying conventions, and I had just finished writing an essay that was part of the Federalist essays. Now, for a long time, they were unknown as to who the author was. They were written as a Roman statesman named Publius, which is translated to public man, which of course is a good name to write under if you're trying to propose a federal or a republican form of government. So Publius ended up being 3 of us. And that came out after Mr. Hamilton died in 1804 at the hands of Mr. Aaron Burr in Weehawken, New Jersey, in that infamous duel on July 11th. And he had written in the frontispiece of his copy of the Federalist who had written each of the essays. Well, Mr. Hamilton decided to write essays for New York newspapers because Anti-Federalists had begun a campaign to purport their views on how they thought there were problems with the Constitution and how they wanted to change it and start over with a brand new convention. After the best men in the country had already convened in Philadelphia the year prior and hammered out a document amongst intelligent men that were aware that they could not get every single part to it that they wanted, that they would have to make compromises such that Roger Sherman made in representation. that his particular one, if you're interested, has to do with Congress and the legislature. The House of Representatives would have proportional representation, but the Senate would not. So each state, no matter its population, not technically its size was defined by its population, would have 2 senators, but the House of Representatives would have more representatives the more population your state had. Another contentious issue in the ratifying conventions was the lack of a Bill of Rights. Now, when I wrote to Mr. Jefferson, my best friend in France at the time, can you imagine not having 2 of our best minds at the convention, the Federal Convention in Philadelphia? Mr. Jefferson was in France. Mr. Adams was in England at the time. And I wrote many, many times letters over and over trying to get Mr. Jefferson's opinion on things. And he said, finally, he said, I will tell you what I do like about the Constitution. And it was this, and such, the other thing. And this is what I do not like. And first on his list was a lack of a Bill of Rights. Now, I said, as I recall, that I never thought an omission was a material defect of any such kind, that it could be a superfluous addition to the Constitution, if necessary, if it would appease our constituents. And that's really what happened, in my opinion, that it would appease our constituents. It would do no harm, but technically it wouldn't enhance the document, because the lack of any statements within the Constitution itself really speaks volumes as to what is required and what is not required. The silence of the Constitution actually spoke volumes. But I ended up in the first Federal Congress being one of the biggest proponents of a Bill of Rights and promising the constituents that their amendments would be considered by writing a Bill of Rights, which was tacked on to the Constitution in the first Federal Congress in your big port city of New York City, which was the first city where our government held court, so to speak. It was not Washington City as we know it today. It was not Philadelphia. It was New York City. Specifically to the ratifying process here in New York, I've mentioned that it took place in Poughkeepsie, downriver, maybe halfway or so towards New York City. Is anyone familiar with Poughkeepsie, New York? You raise your hand if you are. Not even everybody. Well, Poughkeepsie is halfway to New York City on the east side of Hudson's River. And it convened on June the 17th, I recall. And June the 17th, I was in Virginia at part of Virginia's ratifying convention. 5 days earlier, I'd already had a big debate with Patrick Henry and tried to address all his oppositions to the Constitution. And as I recall, on June 17th, I was debating George Mason. And George Mason was at the Federal Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And he was one of those 3 men that did not sign the Constitution. A man within my own contingent. The governor didn't sign, George Mason didn't sign, and neither did Elbridge Gerry, one of my future vice presidents. How do you like this for a bit of irony? Your biggest anti-federalist of them all is your Governor George Clinton, of which your northernmost county is named after, who served in the American Revolution and was quite close to His Excellency General George Washington, our first president, to the point where he even named his children George and Martha Washington Clinton. And he was a general in the Army that defended Forts Clinton and Montgomery during that pivotal Saratoga campaign year, where the Saratoga campaign and the battles of Saratoga took place on September 19th and October 7th, with the surrender on October the 17th at Fort Hardy up in near Schuylerville. But George Clinton was a more ardent anti-federalist than Patrick Henry. So I was very concerned about whether New York would ratify. So when I was asked to help write essays anonymously initially by Mr. Hamilton, I said yes right away. And Mr. John Jay, in fact, our future first Chief Justice, who was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs at the time, And during the ratifying process, he was absolved of his duties by Congress so that he could attend the ratifying convention in Poughkeepsie. And he eventually became our first Chief Justice in the United States. Now, the Federalist essays became published in a book, 2 volumes worth, and then they could be distributed throughout the other states. I asked George Washington myself, do you think that some of these essays would be beneficial if we sent them down to Richmond, as in Richmond, Virginia, where our ratifying convention took place? And he said, yes, send them down right away, which we did. They published them in the papers. But I don't know if any of you have read any of the Federalist essays. Could I see a show of hands of some people that might be familiar with the Federalist essays? Yes, all right, enough of you to know that they're rather long-winded. It is said sometimes that Mr. Hamilton smells of the lamp. He gets rather long-winded, but in fact, all of us got very long-winded in our essay writing, but they got published in the papers. There was 2 papers in New York City that published in serial form, in order, the first 77 essays that were written out of a total of 85 in order to convince your New York constituency that to ratify the Constitution was actually in our favor. Because what would happen if you didn't? You would be left an outcast with a despicable Rhode Island. And so who would want that? I digress again, of course. I just want you to know that James Madison does have a sense of humor. Sometimes people don't think I have a sense of humor. If business is business, sometimes I get serious. But I'm in rather small company and a friendly audience I can see. And I'm also in retirement, so I can let loose a little bit. The New York Ratifying Convention, let's get back to that. It convened on June 17th. Now, I, as a Federalist, speaking as if I was 37 years old, we were outnumbered, 46-19. Your Governor Clinton was so influential in all of the upstate counties, of which you live in Albany County, and just north of here is Washington County, and just north of that, all the way to the Canadian border is Clinton County. And to the west, what was Tryon County has now become Montgomery County, so you now have a total of 9 counties in your state. And it was the downstate counties, including New York City and New York County, along with Kings County and Richmond County, that were Federalist, that wanted the Constitution ratified as is, without amendments, and try it out. The Constitution says that we can amend it, so let's just try it out first, is how we thought about it. But the Anti-Federalists did not think that way. They thought so far that they thought they should convene a second convention, which was radical in our opinion, and not likely to succeed, realizing that we already had our best, as I said before, representation in Philadelphia the year prior. But a series of essays began appearing in newspapers under pseudonyms like Cato and Brutus, other Republican names from Roman Empire. And Mr. Hamilton said, well, somebody got the jump on us. I'm going to start writing to the New York papers. The Independent Journal is the specific one that published 77 serially, and convince in this Clintonian environment that we have to turn the tables on these people and get them to realize that 46 delegates say no to the Constitution and only 19 of us say yes. So he wanted other New Yorkers to help with this process, and he asked 2 very prominent ones. One was Gouverneur Morris, a very charismatic man. If you don't know anything about Gouverneur Morris, I suggest you go visit. He's a very congenial man who is a bit of a flirt with the ladies, has only half of one leg, a very giant, thick-chested man. In fact, here's an anecdote that you'll find comical. His Excellency General George Washington, arguably one of our finest men in our country's history, perhaps the world's, had a statue made of himself, but it was not his chest that the statue was modeled after. It was Mr. Gouverneur Morris's chest. that the statue was modeled after, because Gouverneur Morris had a very large chest. I hear Zeus again. Again, I digress. At least we're trying to have a little fun. During the convention, I was called down to run for election at the Virginia Ratifying Convention against none other than my good friend James Monroe, the current president of the United States. And we always had a friendly rivalry because we had to debate for a seat in the first federal Congress as well. And once I became president of the United States, he became my Secretary of War and my Secretary of State. So we always had a bit of a friendly debates when we had to campaign against each other. You know, it's a sign of the times. I don't know if you realize this, but it's not an approved, necessarily, officially thing to overtly advocate for yourself. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable situation when you go on the campaign trail, as they say. You don't want to be too overt, or somebody will think that you're too egotistical. So you have to be gentlemanly about it. But so I happened to win against Mr. Monroe and participated in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And I was down there when your convention convened in Poughkeepsie on June the 17th. And the Federalist essays, I ended up writing 29 of them. And Mr. Hamilton wrote 51 or so, and Mr. Jay wrote about 5 or so. And I contend that he would have written more. But it was all right, I will tell you. Not because of his physical condition. He had terrible rheumatoid arthritis, to the point where it confined him to his home. And by the way, he lives down in Westchester, New York. He was born and grew up in Katona, and then later had an estate in Rye, New York, both in Westchester County. If it wasn't for his rheumatism, I contend he would have written more than 5. But he wrote something that arguably is more persuasive than all Federalist essays combined that were published in a 2-volume book. And that was simply an address to the people of the state of New York regarding the Constitution. It was only 19 pages long, and many of my compatriots feel it was much more understandable to the common man. And he said something like, he had 3 main points. He said, which boiled down to, if you convene a new convention, what kind of guarantee can you give us that we'll get anything better than we have now? And we're already in a state, I had to write this down because I thought it was so nice. He said this in the address, and I quote, "Our affairs are going from bad to worse, and our distresses are accumulating like compound interest. And if a new convention could not come to an agreement, the Confederation probably would not survive. What would compel you to stay out of a confederation called the United States of America and be stranded in the doldrums, as I said, with the despicable Rhode Island, who didn't ratify until 1791, I believe. 1790 or 91, I think it was 1790, either one. They were the last ones to ratify, fully after the government was running in New York City. He further said in his address that each state would become a little nation, jealous of its neighbors and anxious to strengthen itself by foreign alliances against its former friends. So this made a tremendous amount of sense in turning around an anti-federalist state here in New York because of Governor Clinton's influence. I will say that Albany was unique. In total, the county, Albany County, was very anti-federalist, but Albany itself had a nice little pocket of Federalists. And they got things going with some publications by a gentleman named Charles Webster. Charles Webster was either the owner or co-owner of a couple of Albany newspapers. I don't know if I can remember them. The Albany Journal, yes I can, and the Albany Gazette. I can remember because there's also the Albany Register, but that was not a Charles Webster newspaper. And he wrote favorably for everything. He was relatively nonpartisan in his descriptions of things. And Albany, however, was a nice little conclave of Federalist support for us. Let me review my notes for a second. I want to explain to you, because you seem that you're not thoroughly comfortable with the subject, that the two anti-federalists in New York that were large part of the ratifying convention were also at the federal convention the previous year to write the Constitution. John Lansing, Jr., mayor of Albany, was a large speaker at the New York ratifying convention. Now he, along with his compatriot, also from the Albany area, Robert Yates. Yates is a big family in Schenectady and Albany, as is Lansing. Were down in Philadelphia as part of the New York contingent that also included your Alexander Hamilton. But they left on July 10th, never to return, because they went and told Governor Clinton that we were breaking the rules that the Confederation Congress had said that we could do. They said that we could only modify the Articles of Confederation, the form of government that we were using that was so egregiously weak and so obviously weak that we had to do way more than simply modify it. We had to scrap it, start over again, and build it from the bottom up. Mr. Washington himself said, probe the defects to the bottom and provide radical cures. That is not tinkering with the Articles of Confederation. So when it came to the ratifying convention, John Lansing was one of the more boisterous, and frequent speakers, along with a gentleman named Melancton Smith. Melancton Smith wrote in the newspapers under a pseudonym called a plebeian. And he wrote the most substance to the anti-federalist arguments. But you know that the Federalist arguments were ultimately to survive. He thought two main things, which is summarizes what anti-federalist thinks. Keep the power in the states, which is what the Confederation was a loose collaboration of states, that we really had no formal alliances with each other. And so therefore, it was difficult for George Washington as our commander-in-chief to win the American Revolution. He not only had to be a military strategian and tactician, it was a logistical nightmare for him to have to ask for voluntary participation from each of the colonies at the time. Can you send me men? Can you send me munitions? Can you send me musket balls? Can you send me muskets? Can you send me supplies? Can you send me blankets? And just when some men came, others would leave, and the whole process would start over again. So Melancton Smith said, as a plebeian, that representatives of the people should, quote, be a true picture of the people, possess the knowledge of their circumstances and their wants, sympathize in all their distresses, and be disposed to seek their true interests. So to his mind, men of the middling class should be the ones elected to govern in the federal capacity. That was contrary to what Mr. Hamilton and I thought. Mr. Hamilton and I thought, and I'm going to give you it in quoted form, if I can find it. To me, I said this, I don't remember saying this, that's why I had to refer to it. But to me, rule by the talented, disinterested few is most likely to serve the public good. To remain disinterested is to remain neutral, to put the good of the country and the republic above any personal opinions that you may have. Now, ironically, Melancton Smith ultimately did that to himself, the most prolific of the anti-federalists, shot himself in his foot on purpose because he stood on principle. He was not elected to the federal Senate because ultimately he said that the words that were too strong about writing amendments should be expunged and replaced with something more conciliatory, like recommended amendments. Not make the ratification conditional on amendments. That was too strong, because otherwise that would leave New York out of the Union. Let's just recommend things. Get the country going under the Constitution and utilize the Constitution's principles written within Article 5, that the Constitution can be amended, but not do it after something's already been so arduously worked on. The other thing from my perspective in keeping the power in the states was a term I used called parchment barriers. You can write anything down you like, but whether you follow the rules is another thing. I said that repeated violations of parchment barriers have been committed by overbearing majorities in every state. Whenever there is an interest in power to do wrong, well, wrong will generally be done. And that was a specific topic that I talked about in the very first Federalist essay contribution that I made. There was no fancy titles, we simply numbered them. Mr. Hamilton wrote the first 9, and my first contribution was number 10. And I wrote about the fallibility of man according to the nature of man. And some of that I can attribute to my schooling at the College of New Jersey in Princeton, because of my tutor, the president there, John Witherspoon, who came over, the only reverend and clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence, came over from Scotland to run the College of New Jersey, and had principles from the Enlightenment period, from Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, David Hume, and many, many others, Robertson, Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith, all the philosophers that were talking about natural law. There are certain laws that supersede government, laws and things that we are born with. And had I not known that, I would not be where I am today. I also said this about how men are fallible. And really what this boils down to is that there are internal strife and there can be external strife. In other words, are we being invaded? Are we being attacked? Are we at war? Or are we crumbling at our foundations because of internal strife? But I said it in such a way. I believe there are more instances of abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments than by violent usurpations. So you see, to leave power in the states is to make our country weaker. The centralized government that would put more power in a federal institution derived with a constitution that has both federalist and nationalist principles and combined in a very intricate way that could balance the 3 branches of our government so that no one power could usurp the other is the way to develop the United States of America. Well, it gets to be July 4th, and of course that is our Independence Day celebrations. How did we celebrate that? Well, with cannons and other celebrations, musket fire and music and flag waving, but that did not stop the Committee of the Whole from meeting in Poughkeepsie again to further work on the ratification process, because that did not happen until July the 26th. Word got to New York on July 3rd that my state, Virginia, had ratified. So the antis were very upset with that. So they actually set up, they went to Fort Frederick down in Albany, which was a former British fort near the original Beverwyck, Fort Orange in Beverwyck, when they called Albany by the Dutch name, Beverwyck. Went to Fort Frederick, and they had a ceremonious burning of the Constitution, along with the announcement in the papers that Virginia had ratified the Constitution. Well, the Federalists had to counter with that. They bought a 36-foot pine tree and erected that with the Constitution on the very top of it. And then they decided to take that down and parade it through the streets of Albany until they got to Hendrickson's Tavern. where all the antis were. And the antis came out and they started throwing things and beating things in clubs and creating some violence around that 36-foot pine tree, which to my mind has an equivalent of our old liberty poles that we used to erect before the American Revolution broke out. But that was finally, luckily, abated by the magistrates that got control of the riots. Now, the part that I will end with to show the ultimate victory that we had with the Constitution was how we celebrated in New York City on July the 23rd, 3 days before we actually ratified in New York. That was with a huge and giant parade. Because don't forget now, I'll tell you the end of the story first, which is what city is going to get our government first? Philadelphia wanted it. Why not Boston? Why did it come to be New York? Well, New York had the best port. And New York was very much interested in making everyone else aware that they wanted that federal city. So they were going to put on the best show. They had a parade that was a 1.5 mile route, started at 8 o'clock in the morning, had 10 divisions to symbolically represent the 10 states that had ratified to that point. And then they built a ship, and one that's actually seaworthy, called the Hamilton, after Alexander Hamilton. It was 27 feet long, something like 10 feet high, had 32 guns on it. It was a frigate with canvas waves flapping at its side, pulled by 10 horses on a platform. And within that, they were in the 7th Division, and within that division there was also men that represented the printers, because the parade represented many trades and many crafts and many professions. But in the 7th Division, along with the Hamilton ship, were the printers, and they were printing musical odes to the ratification of the Constitution. So we celebrated in style, and it ended at Nicholas Bayard's property 1.5 miles from the Fields, where it began in downtown Manhattan, and you won't believe what was set up there. Do you know who designed our federal city, our current federal city? The Frenchman, Pierre Lafont. He was the very man that designed a giant arbor, an ardor that people could sit under, and it consisted in spoke-like fashion tables that were 440 feet long each, which was to try and accommodate up to 6,000 people to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution and to show New York's support and excitement about being our first federal capital. So it ended in style. I didn't see the parade, neither did Mr. Hamilton, but after the parade was over, the ship Hamilton was ceremoniously docked at Bowling Green. I don't have a really good ending, I think, because of time and because pretty much the story is over and we've completed the topic of the ratification of the Constitution in New York State. I would be happy to take questions at this time. Mr. Schmelke, I saw you, sir, in the back.
You mentioned Rhode Island being last. Now, if Rhode Island had not ratified the Constitution, would Rhode Island have been delegated to like its own independent country then? It would not be part of the United States?
That's correct. That's correct. I don't know how it would have survived. They were our most stubborn state from the beginning. You know, they never sent a delegate to the Federal Convention at all in 1787 when we met in Philadelphia. And their ratification was almost humorous. It was a popular referendum. In other words, the states could choose the way they wanted to elect their delegates for their ratifying conventions. It wouldn't necessarily be their state legislators. The state legislators could decide how a specialized electorate would be representative simply for the ratification process. But Rhode Island chose to have a popular referendum, and their vote was 10-1 against. I think it was 2,708 against 237 for. 2,708 against a ratification convention. and 237 for. So yes, they have always been very independent. Yes, sir, in the back.
Mr. President, would you comment on how effective the amendments were that you knew about during your life, sir? And how do you guess that amendments went afterwards? Was there a lot of controversy? Were they overwhelming or close by?
Well, what happened was that I made a promise that part of the conditional part of the ratification was that I would promise to advocate for a Bill of Rights, because I knew I was outnumbered. I was not in the majority in that opinion. So many people thought that they were, including Mr. Jefferson, who of course I would listen to, plus many others, that they would be advantageous. As I said, I thought they were superfluous, but they could do no harm. But there was a list of 200 amendments from the various states that they wanted. 32 of them came from your state of New York, with the exception, I don't know how many from Connecticut, I'm sorry, but for the rest of you that are from New York, there was 32 amendments to decide. So I distilled them into what I thought were the most pertinent, and they happened to become what was called our Bill of Rights. So yeah, I see a certain advantage to them with the First Amendment, sometimes called the Five Freedoms, that speak to many individual rights. Yes, they're advantageous. I cannot prognosticate what the future will bring, however. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Now, where was your wife during all this?
I got married in 1794, so I didn't have a wife. Mrs. Madison was formerly married to John Todd of Philadelphia, a lawyer, a Quaker lawyer, but he succumbed to the yellow fever epidemic in 1793. So after I proposed in June, after that was over, she took a few months to decide, and when she said yes, we were married on September the 15th, the very anniversary of my father and mother. Not only on the same day, but in the same place at Harewood Estate, out in Western Virginia, at the home of George Steptoe Washington, George Washington's nephew, who married none other than Mrs. Madison's sister, Lucy. Any other questions? You're going to let me get off easy. And I see Mr. Perello will come up and we can conclude the performance and presentation today. I thank you for keeping your eyes open.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank everybody for coming. As I said, we got events coming up, tours. We will be announcing our own Hall of Fame inductees in the next couple of weeks and have a program for that. They set the date, and then holiday games coming. So hope to see everybody there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.